Welcome. As Christina said, so my name is David Hawkins. I'm the Senior Manager working in Community Planning and Sustainability. I want to begin by just thanking you. Obviously, recognize you're making a choice of how you spend your time. We're very glad that you've chosen to spend it with us. We think this is an important topic, and we look forward to hopefully making it as a productive and useful choice of your time this afternoon. So I'm just going to provide a brief outline just to set some high-level context. And in doing that, I'm hoping to answer the three questions that you can see on the slides in front of you. So briefly, what are we here to discuss this afternoon? What is a development permit area, or DPA, as you'll see it abbreviated to after this? Why are we proposing a DPA? And then I'll finish by how we want to hear from you and moving on to the discussion portion. So what are we here to discuss? So I want to begin with a map showing our community simplified into those three colors. The white is obviously the narrow strip of development, which is where we live, it's where we work and where we shop. And like any community, we are facing and needing to adapt to climate change. So above us to the north in green, you can see our beautiful forested slopes. And our climate change risk here is the potential for wildfire. And last year, Council adopted a development permit area to manage development in the interface areas to require new homes to use things like fire-resistant materials to better protect us all. The other color you can see in blue, which is generally to the south, also very much defines us as a waterfront community and is obviously our ocean. Here, and this is the subject of this workshop, the question is about how we can adapt to the other main climate change risk facing our community, which is that of sea level rise. So on the topic of sea level rise, very simply, there are 3 points that I want to make. The first is that it's occurring faster than it has previously historically. The second is that the province of BC has advised municipalities such as West Vancouver to plan for a 1 meter rise in sea level by the year 2100. And the third is that we've also undertaken third-party expert studies to look at things like our own wave and wind patterns, our own coastal conditions and topography, so that we know as your local government what it is that we should be preparing for. In the chart that you would have seen on the previous slide, it showed a general projection for the future. But I also want to acknowledge right up front that these photos show that coastal flooding is very much a real risk today. It's something that we are already facing. So in terms of applying what we know to better protect our community locally, our studies show that the area in orange on this map is where we want to create a DPA, or development permit area, to manage development given these known and these expected risks. And if you're attending this workshop, my guess is it's likely because you own or represent one of the roughly 840 properties shown in the orange area. So what is a DPA? A DPA is a legislative tool that municipalities adopt and then can use to manage how development occurs given particular conditions and to meet specific objectives. So for the purpose of the Foreshore area, this means owners would require a development permit to protect your property. So in the case that if you were subdividing your land or building a new home, so that it's done in a way that reduces flood risk. And also requiring a development permit for landscaping or altering the land that's in proximity to the ocean so that we can best manage this important and sensitive natural environment. And we'll be using these two themes, protecting property and preserving the environment, to provide more detail than what's on this slide and to structure our subsequent 2 deep dive discussions with you. So why is this being proposed? A lot of due diligence and consideration obviously goes into preparing any new regulations. So for the DPA, this has been considered and studied for a few years, as the timeline on the slide shows. So our overarching guiding document, the official community plan, identified a need for establishing a DPA, which is similar to 9 other BC coastal communities that already have one in place. Our current council strategic plan calls for the threat of floods to be addressed. And we've had both a sub-regional North Shore sea level rise strategy and a Made in West Vancouver citizen-led working group looking at our overall coastline, and they both recommend establishing a DPA. So starting late last year, council provided direction for staff to prepare a DPA and to connect with you on its proposed contents, which is what we're doing today, as is one of 3 workshops. So implicit in that timeline and in any policy development is that alternatives to manage sea level rise impacts have been considered. So on this and the next few slides, you're going to see a diagram. It's not of West Vancouver, but it illustrates the general strategies that are available. And on each slide, I'm going to ask you to focus on the highlighted blue portion on the diagram. So here, one option to respond to sea level rise would be to resist it. This could be by building a berm running along our coastline or raising the existing seawall where there is one. This is not recommended. It would come at great costs and would actually separate homes further and the community further from the ocean, which is the reason so many people choose to live in West Vancouver, is that proximity. Another option would be to avoid sea level rise. This is also known as retreating, moving away gradually from the ocean as property recedes further upland. Again, this is not recommended. It would mean that over time, potentially losing or at least reducing the development potential of your waterfront property. A third option would be to advance. And this would be the opposite of the previous slide, in a sense, where we'd actually build into the ocean, if you like, by constructing things like dikes or using fill. This is also not recommended and would come at great financial cost and with environmental impacts to the ocean. This leads us to the fourth option, and this is what we're recommending through this DPA. Establishing a DPA, it's a way of accommodating sea level rise. It's accepting that it's happening, but adapting to it by managing how we can continue to use these impacted lands, but in a way that allows for safer use and in an environmentally responsible manner. So in blue in the diagram, this means things like raising the elevation at which new homes would be built to reduce their flood risk. So in summary, why we're recommending this approach to climate change adaptation is because it can continue to allow for the use of waterfront lands, but in a way that protects properties from flood damage and preserves this unique foreshore environment. And with the DP in place, should one be adopted, having that map with those areas shown in orange would facilitate decisions for affected property owners with clear guidelines in place that allow for quicker permitting times and also for a shared awareness for both current and future owners, all while supporting the overall resilience to sea level rise for our wider West Vancouver community. So how do we want to hear from you today? This will be the last slide to conclude my introduction, and hopefully it's provided you some high-level context for this workshop and discussion. We are here to provide you with information, answer your questions, and hear any of your suggestions. As mentioned, there's going to be 2 breakout rooms based on the 2 themes, and you'll be moved automatically into one, and then after that session, you'll be moved into the other theme. For protecting your property, Heather Keith, who's our Manager of Environmental Protection, will provide more detail and lead that discussion with the support of Michelle Maguire, who's our Senior Manager of Current Planning. And for the Preserving the Environment theme, our 2 environmental protection officers will be there, with Marie Metadou leading the discussion and Steph Louis also available for your questions.
This session is focusing on redevelopment of your property, and protecting your property from coastal flood risk. So as David mentioned, the Foreshore DPA and the proposed changes are specific to building new houses or subdividing your property. So if you wanted to do one of these 2 things, you would need to build at an elevation where your house is safe from coastal flooding. And so we have a method to determine the safe elevation. So this is what we refer to as the flood construction level. And it's the lowest elevation of the underside of a wooden floor or top of concrete slab for a building where people live. So we're focusing on habitable space where people are living and sleeping. And so in 2018, the province updated their flood hazard land use management guidelines. And this provided guidance to local governments, as David indicated, to plan for a 1 meter sea level rise by the year 2100. And in these updated guidelines, they provided a calculation for the flood construction level for a house. So the flood construction level takes into account the water level, which takes into account tides and storm surge. It looks at, it adds in land subsidence or uplift, depending on where you are in the area in the world. This 1 meter sea level rise, and then wave effects. So the wave run up onto your property or up to land. And then there's a degree of error that's added into the calculation. So by putting these all together, you get a flood construction level, which is an elevation where you can build your house for safe use. So in 2019, the district, we started a coastal mapping study and a coastal planning study. And what we did is that we, for 17 different areas along the coastline, and these areas were defined based on their topography, we calculated the flood construction level across the entire coastline. And we use this mapping to define the development permit area. So these are the boundary of the development permit area. And what this means is that we included all properties that are at an elevation at risk of coastal flooding. So all properties below this flood construction level that we've calculated. And so that's how we determine the development permit area. So, and then just to draw on this a little bit more, because the provincial methodology came out in January of 2018, the district actually has been requiring all new houses within the coastal flood hazard area to build to the flood construction level. So this actually isn't a new requirement, but we have been requiring this at the building permit stage since 2018. And the concerns or comments that we've received back from applicants and homeowners is that it's not a clear process. There's not a formalized framework, and the process has been a bit long and onerous. So part of the Foreshore development permit area, part of the benefit is to formalize this and provide clear, concise instructions and guidelines to developers and homeowners should they be wishing to build a new house. So in this, we can give you two options to determine the flood construction level for your property. So if you want to build a new house on your property, or you're working with someone that would like to build a new house, you can either choose to use the area-wide flood construction level that the district has calculated. So we would provide that to you for the area where your property is located. And if you're able to build above this elevation, then we know that your house is safe from coastal flooding and you're exempt from requiring to get a development permit. So this option, number one, would be most applicable for properties where the flood construction level that we've mapped may not cover the entire property. So if you're out west of in West Vancouver and on a property that has a steep slope down to the ocean, likely the flood construction level that we've mapped doesn't encompass your whole property, and you're likely able to build above it. And so then you would be okay and could move forward with your building permit application. Otherwise, if this doesn't apply to your property, something that might be more applicable is to calculate a site-specific flood construction level. So in this way, you would engage with a coastal engineer, and they would calculate a flood construction level based on the specific site features of your property, as well as your proposed building plans. And then you would apply for a development permit with this flood hazard assessment report and your proposed building plans. And we would be then assured that the building was built safely for safe use, as long as it adheres to the recommendations by the coastal engineer. So we've seen over the past couple of years, both instances, there's been some properties that have been well above the elevation that we've calculated, and so they've been able to move forward to the building permit stage. But there's been quite a few properties that have calculated a site-specific flood construction level and used that in order to build their new house. The advantage of the site-specific flood construction level is that it's often calculated to be lower than our area-wide flood construction levels. And this is because our coastal mapping study couldn't take into account the wave run-up or the wave effects on a specific property, which is the main driver of the flood construction level. So we weren't able to account for that in our modeling work. So our FCLs tend to be a bit more conservative or higher. But when you look at a property and you look at the features and you look at the if it's protected from waves, or if it has a seawall or some sort of features that might minimize the wave impacts, then often the flood construction level would be lower. So in areas where you're low lying, in some of our areas along the coast, it's probably to your advantage to use a site-specific flood construction level to design your new house and your site. So just to show you quite simply, so if you have your house and it's already your proposed house and it's already above the area FCL that the district will provide to you, we know that it's safe and it's above the elevation that's at risk of coastal flooding. We would review that and sign off, and you wouldn't require to have a development permit to rebuild the house. Or if your house or your property is below this area FCL that has been calculated for the area where your property is located, you can either raise the grade to be at the area FCL that's been calculated, or you can calculate a site-specific FCL. The raising the grade to meet the area FCL may not be applicable for areas where your property is entirely encompassed or entirely below the area FCL, just because the raising the grade might be quite significant. So it's likely to your benefit to calculate a site specific FCL. So in taking those requirements into account, there is some flexibility for homeowners. We are focusing to have houses built to the flood construction level because we want to ensure that life safety and property is above the risk of coastal flooding. But there are structures and some work that can be done below the FCL. And this is to provide some flexibility in the design of your site and how you want to develop your site. So if you just wanted to do interior renovations to an existing building or house, you wouldn't be required to rebuild the house to the flood construction level. You could do interior renovations and remain at the existing elevation. Any carports, or garages could be below the flood construction level because it's not habitable living space. And other minor buildings such as storage buildings, sheds, greenhouses, pools, decks, those sorts of things, they can be below the flood construction level. And so the province has already also provided some exemption guidelines that we've incorporated into the proposed Foreshore DPA. And one of them is to allow flexibility for small additions to existing houses. So if you were to propose an addition to your house that's below the flood construction level that we've calculated, but as long as you're not increasing the size, as long as the addition is less than 25% of the existing floor space that's below the FCL, then you wouldn't need to rebuild the entire house to the FCL. So I have seen some applications where people have put a small addition at the elevation below the FCL and then put larger additions on the second floor that is often above the FCL. So there is some flexibility to expand your house without having to rebuild the entire building. Commercial and business space does not need to be built above the flood construction level. This is because people don't typically live in stores and business spaces, but we do require that a flood hazard assessment is done and mitigation measures are put in place. And this is primarily to alleviate concerns of fires starting from flooding. So we would require flood proofing of mechanical and electrical infrastructure and those types of things, so that if a business should flood, they wouldn't spread fire, or fire wouldn't start to other businesses as well. So this is primarily important to the lower business areas such as Ambleside and Horseshoe Bay. And then the other thing that could be considered are variances to the zoning bylaw to be able to build up to the FCL should you need to be raising the grade of your property. So we have seen many, about 5 or 6 of these applications come through where they're requesting variances to the height of their house or the side yard or front yard setbacks in order to be able to develop the house that they'd like to do. So these are options that homeowners could explore to be able to build safely, but also achieve what they want to have. So then in the last couple of years, going through some of these applications, particularly ones where we've had zoning variance requests, there has been concerns raised by neighbors of how the raising the grade of one property impacts neighbors. So the guidelines that have been developed and the proposed changes are also accounting for these sensitivities and have been developed to minimize impacts to neighbors. So as I mentioned before, the recommendations from coastal engineers would need to include life safety measures or flood proofing measures for mechanical and electrical infrastructure to minimize any damage. And one that's of particular importance is the stormwater management for a property. So every building application that comes in needs to have a stormwater management plan that's developed by an engineer. And they need to ensure that the control of stormwater or rainwater is controlled on site and it's not changed from pre to post development. So the stormwater management plan needs to account now for the changes in the grade of the site. Should it need to be elevated, it needs to be integrated with the landscaping, both hard and softscaping. And it needs to account for all of these to ensure that the drainage is controlled and its outlet to the ocean and not to adjacent properties. So that's one element that we'd be looking for when we're reviewing these applications. The other component that has been raised is landscaping. So if your neighbor is raising their grade to an elevation for the flood construction level, there are concerns about view and privacy. So we would be requesting landscaping plans, and those need to address grade differences. We want to ensure that there's screening and privacy landscaping, and but also that your proposed development is not impacting views from other neighbors. So these are all things that our team or staff would review with the development permit applications. In addition, and along those lines, if you're requesting zoning variances, you also need to account for proximity to adjacent dwellings. You need to look at sight lines and the changes between your neighbor or you and your neighbors. So all of these would be addressed and reviewed at the development permit stage. So the other, as I alluded to at the beginning, is that some of these applications that have come through over the last couple of years have been quite a long process. And so the Foreshore DPA, the benefit of it is to ensure that it's a more efficient permitting process. So, and that everybody has clear guidelines and information should they want to apply for development permits. So this is a very similar permitting process to what we do for environmental development permits for watercourse protection or for wildfire hazard development permits in the district. So you would apply for your development permit before your building permit application, because we want to ensure that everything's addressed at the development permit stage, so you don't need to come back and redo things. We would be providing all the submission checklist, all of the information and resources and staff contacts on the website should this policy be adopted, so that we can help you through this process. The application will be reviewed by my team in planning and potentially the planning department if there's zoning requests or zoning variance requests. Once the guidelines are met, then the approval is by the director of planning. So we're proposing that the approval of these development permits are delegated to staff and would not need to go through council. So this actually saves quite a bit of time and would speed up the process, so you could move forward with your building permit application. Once the development permit is issued, it does get registered to title so that it runs with the land and ensures that future owners are aware of the conditions for safe use of the property. You can apply for your building permit, and then at the final completion of your project, as similar as when you have a final inspection for your building permit, we would do the final inspection for the development permit and complete the project. So we do hope that with this proposed policy that the permitting mechanism would be faster and less onerous for applicants than it might have been in the last couple of years.
Good afternoon. My name is Marie Madatu. I am the district's Environmental Protection Officer. I'd like to thank you for attending this session. This is to provide you information on the proposed changes in relation to preserving the natural environment of the foreshore area. For those that do not know what the foreshore area is, it is the area below the natural boundary of the ocean, which is the high tide mark. We use the word preserving the environment because our goal is to sustain its resources and at the same time developing new methods to keep it safe. Therefore, preserving is more comprehensive than protecting, while looking at mitigating any impacts on the natural environment in relation to development. Do you want to work near the water? As David explained in the introduction, there is a component of the Foreshore DPA that controls work to minimize any impacts on the natural environment. Specifically, we're focusing on the area on private property within 50 meters of the natural boundary of the ocean, and land disturbances within this area comprise of alteration of land, installation of structures and hard surfaces, and tree cutting as defined in the tree bylaw. 15 meters from the natural boundary is a buffer area of the intertidal environment and is considered the riparian area that feeds into the intertidal habitat, similar to the setback area along creeks for the protection of fish and fish habitat. What is being preserved? So what are we trying to preserve? The riparian zone for the foreshore area, because this area is an impact pathway to fish and fish habitat of the intertidal environment, and we want to minimize disturbance and impact. We want to maintain a buffer zone, also known as the riparian area, which is consistent to how we preserve the creeks through a DPA as well. This is also similar to fisheries and oceans when they review projects near water through the pathways of effects, as development activities within this riparian zone has the potential to be a stressor and or affect fish and fish habitat. We require a buffer to protect the function of the ocean and the environment from pollution and runoff, such as the result of excavation activities, scour and erosion due to grading and placement of materials, or loss of habitat through vegetation clearing and tree cutting. What do we want to accomplish? The DPA has goals to ensure that the foreshore environment continues to be maintained and supported as the communities along the waterfront continue to redevelop over time. For new development within the riparian zone, which is 50 meters of the natural boundary, you want to avoid and mitigate impacts to the foreshore environment by preserving healthy trees and shrubs, minimizing pollution and runoff, naturalizing the waterfront areas where possible using a green shores approach, restrict hard structures that increase scour and erosion of the foreshore. Sensitivity to the natural environment. First, we're not saying you can't put anything in this area, but we want to ensure that what is put in this area is taking into consideration the natural environment. In order to work within the 50-meter buffer zone or the riparian area, which would be any land alteration activities and installation of structures and hard surfaces and tree cutting as defined in the tree bylaw. You'll need to engage with a qualified environmental professional to assess the proposed plans for redevelopment and determine whether there are any potential impacts, and if so, how can these be mitigated? We are focusing on mitigation through the construction phase, but also long-term mitigation to preserve the foreshore. When you're proposing works within 50 meters of the natural boundary, you'll need to engage with a qualified professional to determine how to minimize these impacts to the foreshore by considering the following mitigation measures. Use of materials in this area that will not be continually damaged during storms and cause debris into the ocean. Minimize the footprint size and disturbance. Include measures to minimize scour and erosion to the foreshore so that the beach area does not continue to be eroded and scoured over time. Natural landscaping to minimize development impacts. Or filter any pollutants through vegetation prior to entering the environment, and that the foreshore environment is enhanced through planting of suitable plant and tree species. We want to preserve the important features such as trees and outcroppings, and we want to ensure slope stability, wave impacts, storms with respect to ongoing maintenance requirements. This is not a mechanism to require removal of existing structures that have been permitted and comply with the current bylaws. We're focusing on new development, new work within this area, and how the new development can be mitigated to minimize impacts to the natural environment. How can we preserve the natural environment? We want to ensure what is built within this area is sensitive to the environment, protects the environment, is built well to withstand storms, high energy to alleviate loss of debris in the ocean, and avoid rebuilding each year. Some options are the following. For retaining walls near the waterfront property line, create a vegetated buffer between the wall and the foreshore, or install a vegetative wall to reduce erosion and enhance the foreshore area. For proposed pools, install a non-chlorinated pool with a pool enclosure fence to allow for wave movement, not glass or solid panels. By using picket fences for pool enclosures, this will allow for wave flow through versus enclosed fences that will increase wave energy or be damage. For tree cutting, such as hazard tree removals, use replacement with suitable coastal species and try working around trees to preserve important features. For construction of paths to access the foreshore area, use natural materials, minimize the footprint, and design a path that works with natural site features such as trees and bedrock. For decks, use only stairs or a path to access the foreshore versus decks and landings. If this is not feasible, use permeable materials or non-treated products to minimize debris and chemicals from entering the ocean. Use environmentally sensitive materials by avoiding concrete and styrofoam for docks, and avoid the need for excavating. So what are the benefits? As mentioned, there are many benefits to naturalize the waterfronts and focusing on naturalized materials. We just want to reiterate that they can also be a benefit to the homeowners. The benefits of naturalized shorelines are the following: decreased wave energy, it increases resilience to flooding, improves shore access, enhances shoreline habitat, and maintains shoreline connectivity. Whereas hardened shorelines, such as seawalls, increases wave energy and overtopping. It results in scour and erosion of the foreshore area, creates loss of intertidal habitat, and debris from storm damage. Flexibility for homeowners. We understand that these proposed changes may require additional permitting for work on your property, but we want you to understand that regular work on your property is exempt, and we're trying to focus on major land disturbance activities. The following activities would be exempt from requiring a foreshore DPA: routine maintenance of existing landscaping, land alteration outside of the 50 meters of the natural boundary of the ocean. So these would be properties not directly on the waterfront, or work on a waterfront property outside of that 50-meter buffer zone. The intention of the DPA is not to require removal of existing structures that have been permitted and comply with the current bylaws, but to address impacts of new structures to the environment and protect it against flood hazards. I want to add that we encourage a removal of hard structures that have had impacts to the foreshore, but understand that this may not be possible and would not be a requirement of the DPA. Please note that if this policy is adopted, staff will be available to answer questions and help determine whether your work needs a DP. Staff have quite a bit of experience with this as we communicate regularly with homeowners with creeks on their property to help them determine what is feasible.